Targaryen Lore, The Mad King's Ashes, Aerys II, and the Forgotten Prophecy, Part 515, The Golden Promise and the Growing Shadow from a Promising King to an Incendiary Tyrant. Do you know what transformed Aerys Targaryen into the Mad King? And what was the role of whispers, betrayals, and a distorted prophecy in his ruin? Prepare to unravel the disturbed mind of a monarch who sealed the fate of his dynasty with wildfire and paranoia, and how his madness cast a shadow over the Song of Ice and Fire. In the year 244 after conquest, Aerys was born, the second son of Prince Jaehaerys, the heir apparent. No one could have predicted that this young prince, born in a time of relative peace and prosperity, would be destined to be the last Targaryen king to sit on the Iron Throne before Robert's rebellion. His childhood was marked by a remarkable beauty and a natural charm, qualities that made him beloved by all. His hair was almost white gold, his eyes, the deep violet of his lineage, and his skin, fair and immaculate. He was, in every sense, an heir of dignified and promising appearance. Aerys' youth was spent in the opulent corridors of the Red Keep and on the windswept lands of Dragonstone, his family's ancestral home. From an early age, Aerys demonstrated a quick intellect and a sharp sense of humor. He was popular among the young lords and ladies of the court, and his natural charisma made him a favorite. There was no sign in his youth of the madness that would come to consume him. He was the personification of hope for the future of House Targaryen. His ascension to the throne after the premature death of his father, Jaehaerys II, was met with optimism throughout the realm. Westeros yearned for a strong and charismatic king. Aerys, at the beginning of his reign, seemed to be exactly that. He had grand ideas, visions for the realm that promised innovation, and a return to ancient Targaryen glory. There was talk of great public works, of a more just and prosperous realm. Enthusiasm was palpable, and the court, which had suffered under previous reigns, saw in Aerys a new chance for splendor. Aerys' friendship with Tywin Lannister, the young and brilliant Lord of Casterly Rock, was one of the pillars of his early reign. Tywin was a man of sharp intellect, a military strategist, and an unparalleled administrator. He was the personification of competence and order. Aerys, in an act of great initial wisdom, named Tywin as his Hand of the King. The partnership between the charismatic king and the brilliant executive promised to be legendary. Tywin ruled the realm with ruthless efficiency, bringing order, prosperity, and a stability Westeros had not seen in a long time. Aerys trusted Tywin, and the court admired his hand's strength and shrewdness. In addition to his friendship with Tywin, Aerys also married his own sister, Rhaella Targaryen. It was a common practice among the Targaryens to keep the pure dragon blood. Rhaella was a woman of captivating beauty and a gentle nature, but her marriage to Aerys was destined to be a union of pain and suffering, especially as the king's mind began to disintegrate. The first seeds of Aerys' paranoia were not planted by grand events, but by small fissures, by envy and hidden fears. Tywin Lannister's resounding success as Hand of the King, his ability to govern with an efficiency and wealth that surpassed those of the king himself, began to corrode Aerys' soul. The king, once proud to have such a capable hand, began to feel that Tywin was more admired and respected than he himself. The court's whispers, the praises for Tywin, were bitter music to Aerys' ears. This envy gradually transformed into distrust. Aerys began to doubt Tywin's loyalty, to see conspiracies where there were none. He believed that Tywin was using his power for his own benefit and not for the good of the realm. Tywin's actions, once seen as brilliant, were now interpreted as cold calculations of a man who yearned for the throne. The friendship, the pillar of his reign, began to crumble under the weight of the king's paranoia. Beyond envy, the question of succession began to haunt Aerys. His wife, Queen Rhaella, had several miscarriages and children who died young. As his children died, Aerys began to doubt the purity of Rhaella's blood, and his paranoia intensified. He desperately sought a strong and healthy Targaryen heir to ensure the continuity of his dynasty. Every loss was a blow to his already fragile psyche. Then Prince Rhaegar was born, a strong, beautiful, and charismatic Targaryen son. At first, Rhaegar was Aerys' joy, the golden hope he so desired. But as Rhaegar grew and his popularity increased, jealousy and fear began to poison the king's mind. Rhaegar was everything Aerys had been, and everything he was losing. The dignity, the charisma, the respect of the lords, all this seemed to emanate from Rhaegar in a way Aerys could no longer emulate. The king began to see his own son as a threat, a rival, a potential conspirator. He believed that Rhaegar was seeking the throne, that his popularity was a tool to overthrow him. The relationship between father and son became tense and filled with distrust. Aerys, in his madness, saw ghosts of conspiracies in every shadow. And Rhaegar, the beloved heir, became the target of his paranoia. The Summerhall disaster was a turning point, a tragic event that would deepen Aerys II's madness and melancholy. In 259 after conquest, a great tragedy befell House Targaryen at Summerhall, one of their summer residences. King Aegon V, Aerys' grandfather, had become obsessed with hatching dragon eggs, trying to bring back the magnificent winged beasts that had been the source of Targaryen power. He believed that Valyrian magic could be revived, and that dragons could once again fly through the skies of Westeros. Aegon V gathered his children and grandchildren, including young Aerys, at Summerhall for a grand ritual. The goal was to hatch the last known dragon eggs, but the ritual went terribly wrong. A massive fire erupted at Summerhall, consuming the castle in flames and taking the lives of several members of the royal family. King Aegon V himself, his son Jaehaerys II, Aerys' father, and Prince Duncan the Small died in the fiery inferno. Summerhall Castle was reduced to ashes, a monument to a tragic ambition and a misunderstood magic. Aerys II, who was present at Summerhall and witnessed the destruction, was deeply traumatized by the event. He lost his grandfather and his father in a single night, in a fiery hell he would never forget. Fire, which was once the symbol of his Targaryen glory, became for him a symbol of tragedy and loss. This event marked the beginning of his fixation with wildfire, a highly flammable and difficult to control substance, which he saw as the true essence of Targaryen power. He spent hours observing the fire, fascinated and terrified. In addition to the trauma, the Summerhall disaster fueled Aerys' paranoia. He believed that the tragedy had been an act of treason, a conspiracy to destroy his family. His already fragile mind began to see enemies everywhere, especially those he already distrusted, like Tywin Lannister. He began to isolate himself in the Red Keep, his behavior becoming increasingly erratic and unpredictable. The loss of his closest relatives, the death of his newborn children, and the horror of Summerhall all contributed to Aerys' plunge into melancholy and madness. He spent long periods in seclusion, avoiding the company of his wife and counselors. His dreams were tormented by visions of fire and betrayal, and his voice, once charismatic, began to whisper about flames and hidden enemies. The Summerhall tragedy had sealed the fate of Aerys Targaryen. The king who was once the golden promise of his realm was now on a path of no return to madness. Every whisper, every shadow, every act of his court would now be interpreted through the prism of his growing paranoia. In the next chapter, we will delve deeper into the mind of Aerys II. You will understand how his obsession with heirs and a distorted prophecy led him to unimaginable acts of cruelty, and how the figure of Tywin Lannister became the target of his deepest envy. Prepare for the whispers of a king who slowly but inexorably lost his own mind, taking an entire dynasty with him. The decline and the desperate search for an heir. The Summerhall disaster had cast a permanent shadow over Aerys II's soul. Fire, which for other Targaryens was a symbol of glory and power, for him became a constant reminder of loss and tragedy. Melancholy enveloped him like a heavy cloak, and paranoia took root, distorting his perception of reality. He saw conspiracies in every shadow, betrayal in every smile. But beyond the trauma of Summerhall, another source of anguish consumed the king: the fragility of his lineage and the obsession with securing an heir. Queen Rhaella, Aerys' wife, was a woman of great beauty and patience, but her marriage was marked by a tragic series of losses. Aerys and Rhaella had an offspring cursed by infant mortality. a painful succession of stillbirths, miscarriages, and babies who lived only a few hours or days. Before Rhaegar's birth, Prince Daeron had died in infancy. Prince Shaena, Prince Jaehaerys, Prince Daella, Prince Vaegon, Prince Aerys. Each loss was a devastating blow to Aerys' already fragile psyche. This series of infant tragedies fueled the king's paranoia. He began to doubt Rhaella's purity and fertility, accusing her of infidelity, or that her blood was no longer worthy of bearing the dragon. He believed that the gods, or perhaps hidden enemies, were punishing him, denying him a strong and healthy Targaryen heir to ensure the continuity of his dynasty. The obsession with succession became a constant torment for the king and for the queen, who silently suffered the accusations and the pain of loss. In his desperate search for a solution to the curse of his children, Aerys resorted to increasingly extreme measures. He consulted maesters and septons, seeking medical and spiritual advice. But as his mind became disturbed, he turned to darker paths. He began to frequent the company of alchemists and sorcerers, seeking forbidden fertility rituals, spells, and prophecies that promised to secure the lineage. He delved into ancient texts on dark magic and surrounded himself with individuals who promised him power in exchange for secrets and favors. This search for answers in obscure realms of magic is proof of how much his mind was drifting from reality, logic, and sanity. The birth of Viserys, his second male child, brought a brief relief, a spark of hope that quickly faded. Viserys was weak and dependent, and Aerys already had Rhaegar, the heir everyone loved, but whom he came to fear. Later, Daenerys would be born amidst even greater chaos. But these births, though they guaranteed the survival of his immediate lineage, did not eradicate Aerys' madness. Instead, they distorted it even further, focusing paranoia on his own eldest son, Rhaegar, whom he saw as a growing threat. The tragedy of royal infertility, or his perception of it, had sown the seeds of madness that now sprouted. The incident at Duskendale was the final catalyst that plunged Aerys II into the depths of madness and paranoia. In 277 after conquest, Lord Dennis Darklyn of Duskendale, an ambitious and discontented man, took a reckless stance. Enraged by heavy royal taxes and the diminution of his influence, he refused to pay royal dues and declared his independence from the crown. In a desperate gamble, he invited King Aerys to Duskendale for negotiations, with the hidden intention of taking him hostage and demanding great concessions. Tywin Lannister, the Hand of the King, a man of pragmatism and shrewdness, advised Aerys not to go. He suggested sending a large military force to subdue Duskendale, but Aerys, in his growing arrogance and desire to prove his own strength, rejected Tywin's advice. He decided to go to Duskendale personally, accompanied only by Sir Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard and a small retinue, believing his majestic presence would be enough to intimidate Lord Darklyn. It was a fatal mistake. In Duskendale, Aerys was captured and held captive by Lord Darklyn for almost a year. 9 months of terror and humiliation known as the Defiance of Duskendale. Aerys was physically and psychologically tortured, beaten, deprived of sleep, and threatened with death. The terror and powerlessness of being a prisoner in his own land, at the hands of a lesser lord, broke what little sanity he had left. His long golden hair became matted and his fingernails grew, for he refused to cut them, a habit he would keep until the end of his days as a reminder of his captivity. Tywin Lannister, against Aerys' will, who feared being killed by his captors, besieged Duskendale, refusing to negotiate with Lord Darklyn. Tywin's patience and strategy were ruthless. He was ready to burn the entire city to rescue the king. It was Sir Barristan Selmy, the daring Kingsguard knight, who carried out the heroic rescue. He infiltrated Duskendale alone, killed Lord Darklyn and his son, and freed the king. Aerys was saved, but the cost to his mind was immeasurable. Aerys returned from Duskendale a completely transformed man. He was physically frail, with wounds and scars that would never heal. But it was the mental scars that had broken him. His paranoia reached levels incompatible with sanity. He trusted no one, not even his own family and counselors. Tywin Lannister, his once loyal hand, became the target of his deepest distrust. Aerys believed that Tywin had deliberately delayed rescuing him quickly, hoping he would die in captivity, so that Tywin could ascend to the throne with his own son Rhaegar. This idea, though absurd, became rooted in his sick mind. He developed an extreme fear of blades and shears, which led him to never again cut his hair or fingernails. His appearance became wild and disheveled, a reflection of his chaotic mind. He also hated being touched and refused to bathe, his personal hygiene deteriorating drastically. The smell of his body and his appearance were a visible sign of his growing madness, alienating everyone. Aerys' obsession with wildfire, which had begun with the trauma of Summerhall, intensified exponentially after Duskendale. He saw wildfire as the purest substance, the only thing that could not betray him. He spent hours and days in the company of pyromancers, the alchemists who worked with wildfire. He believed that wildfire was the true essence of his Targaryen lineage, and that with it, he could purify himself and destroy all his enemies. He saw wildfire as a means of divine purification and absolute destruction. Fear and filth led him to withdraw into himself, and wildfire became his only refuge. Aerys' return from Duskendale marked the beginning of the end of his relationship with Tywin Lannister, the most competent and powerful figure in his realm. Aerys' envy and paranoia towards Tywin transformed into open and public hostility. He sought to humiliate Tywin at every opportunity, mocking his competence and loyalty. Aerys refused to listen to Tywin's advice, however wise it was, and began to dismantle his authority. The final straw came with Aerys' refusal to marry his son and heir, Rhaegar, to Cersei Lannister, Tywin's beautiful daughter. Tywin, a man of immense pride and ambition, had expressed his desire for this union, which would have sealed one of the most powerful marriages in Westeros history. But Aerys, in an act of calculated cruelty, rejected the proposal with an infamous phrase, declaring that he would not marry his son to a lion's cub. This was a personal and public insult to Tywin, a rejection of his loyalty and his power. The humiliation was enough for Tywin. After years of loyal service and suffering Aerys' eccentricities, he could no longer bear it. Tywin Lannister resigned as Hand of the King, returning to Casterly Rock. He took his children, Jaime and Cersei, with him. Tywin's departure left an immense void in Westeros government. Aerys, now isolated in his Red Keep, was surrounded by flatterers and less capable counselors who dared not challenge his madness. After Tywin's departure, Aerys appointed a succession of hands who were, for the most part, ineffective or subservient. Lord Owen Merryweather, Lord John Connington, and finally, the pyromancer Rossart. These men lacked Tywin's competence, and many of them merely fueled Aerys' delusions to keep their own necks. The realm, deprived of Tywin's firm hand, began to suffer. Taxes were poorly collected, justice was perverted, and disorder grew. Aerys' madness, now unchecked, was about to consume Westeros. King Aerys II had become a prisoner in his own mind. Envy, trauma, and paranoia isolated him in a world of delusions and flames. Tywin Lannister's departure sealed the fate not only of the king, but of the entire Targaryen dynasty. In the next chapter, we will delve into Aerys II's cruelest acts. You will understand how his obsession with distorted prophecies and his mania for setting his enemies ablaze led him to commit atrocities, and what was the role of courtiers and pyromancers in his downfall. Prepare for the whispers of a king who turned the dragon's fury into a plague upon his own people. Madness consolidates, fires, and prophecies. With Tywin Lannister's departure, the last voice of reason and competence that dared to challenge him, King Aerys II was free to plunge even deeper into his own madness. Surrounded now only by fawning courtiers and counselors who feared his fury more than they valued truth, Aerys isolated himself in the Red Keep, his behavior becoming increasingly erratic, unpredictable, and above all, cruel. The realm, once governed with a firm hand by Tywin, began to feel the weight of a king who had lost touch with reality. Aerys II's reign of terror was not an act of strategy, but an impulsive and paranoid manifestation of his disintegrating mind. He did not burn his enemies for a clear political advantage, but out of pure distrust and a disturbed desire for purification. Fire, which had been the source of his trauma at Summerhall, became his obsession and his preferred method of execution. Aerys came to believe that fire purified the soul, and that by burning his supposed traitors, he was actually cleansing the realm. His public executions became a horrifying spectacle, terrifying the court and the people of King's Landing. He ordered his enemies to be burned alive. Men and women, some of whom had been loyal to him for years, were dragged to the pyre, and the king reveled in their screams, seeing them as the sweetest music. The pyromancers, those who worked with wildfire, became his closest confidants, fueling his fantasy and supplying the substance he so desired. Flames became his justice, and the smell of burning flesh, the perfume of his reign. One of the most notorious cases of his cruelty was the fate of House Darklyn and Hollard of Duskendale, revisiting the trauma that had broken him. After being held prisoner by Lord Dennis Darklyn, Aerys had vowed relentless revenge. He exterminated the entire Darklyn lineage, except for one infant, and brutally disfigured Lady Serala Darklyn, Dennis' wife. Sir Simon Hollard, the last living member of House Hollard and an ally of the Darklyns, was executed in a particularly cruel manner, burned alive. Aerys refused to forgive, and his reign became a succession of purges and executions that spread fear throughout all 7 kingdoms. Lords and their families lived under constant terror, fearing that any misplaced word or any look of distrust could lead to a painful death by the king's flames. Amidst this escalating madness, Aerys II made a decision that seemed like an honor, but was in fact an act of calculated cruelty, a way to spite Tywin Lannister. He named Jaime Lannister, Tywin's son and heir, to the Kingsguard. The Kingsguard was an elite order, the most honored in Westeros, but its members took an oath of celibacy and to hold no lands or children, renouncing their inheritances. For a lord, having his son named to the Kingsguard was a great honor. But for Tywin, who had already lost his wife and whose eldest son would become heir to Casterly Rock, this meant the loss of his most promising successor, Jaime. Jaime, still young and impressed by the honor, accepted the white cloak with pride. He did not perceive Aerys' trap. Tywin, however, saw his king's maneuver clearly. Aerys was not honoring Jaime. He was humiliating Tywin, robbing him of his heir and mocking his lineage. This was one more of Aerys' many provocations that led Tywin to finally resign as Hand of the King. For Jaime, the experience of serving Aerys was disillusioning and traumatic. He had joined the Kingsguard to serve an honorable king, but he found a lunatic. Jaime witnessed Aerys' madness firsthand, his manias, his cruelties, his executions. He saw his king transform into a monster, and his oath to protect the king began to conflict with his own morals and the responsibility to protect the realm from the king himself. The honored Kingsguard found themselves trapped serving a tyrant, forced to witness acts that defied decency. This experience would mark Jaime forever, shaping his reputation as the Kingslayer and a man of broken oaths. Aerys II's disturbed mind also fixated on prophecies, but in a very different and more dangerous way than his son Rhaegar. While Rhaegar sought the prince that was promised and the 3 heads of the dragon to save the world from an external threat, Aerys interpreted these same prophecies as a means of reaffirming his own power and purifying himself of his internal enemies. He believed that the prophecy meant the return of dragons, and that he, the last Targaryen king, would be the catalyst for that return. His obsession with dragons became a mania. He sent expeditions across the world in search of dragon eggs, believing he could hatch them with wildfire. He surrounded himself with charlatans and visionaries who promised him the return of dragons. His growing frustration with the failure to hatch a single egg only fueled his paranoia, convincing him that there were conspiracies against him, preventing him from bringing the dragons back. He saw every unhatched egg as a sign of betrayal. Aerys also had a distorted interpretation of the prophecy about the dragon has 3 heads. He did not see this as a need for heirs or a union of blood, but as a sign that he needed 3 heads for his own existence, possibly 3 loyal pyromancers, or 3 guards, or perhaps 3 dragons he still dreamed of controlling. His mind associated the prophecy with his desire for absolute power and destruction. Furthermore, He had a growing paranoia that his enemies would try to poison him. He ate and drank little, and only food he had personally provided. His widespread distrust led him to shy away from food itself, seeing it as a potential weapon of his enemies. This persecution mania isolated him even further, and his world became smaller, populated only by his delusions and his pyromancers. As Aerys II isolated himself, his only confidants and companions became the pyromancers. These alchemists, who worked with wildfire, found in Aerys a perfect patron and a malleable mind to manipulate. They encouraged him in his obsession, promising him power and purification through flames. For Aerys, wildfire was the purest Targaryen substance, a fire that could not betray him as men and life itself did. Under Aerys' command, the pyromancers began to produce massive quantities of wildfire. Tons of the green and volatile substance were secretly stored beneath the Red Keep, under the streets and buildings of King's Landing. Aerys was not storing wildfire merely for defense. He had a sinister and apocalyptic plan. If he could not reign over the city, he would burn it to its foundations, turning it into burning ashes, a fiery funeral for his dynasty. He saw this as the ultimate fate of his realm, a great purification by fire. Aerys was convinced that this would be his last and greatest victory, a way to show the world the true power of the dragon, even if it was a mad dragon. The population of King's Landing, unaware of these secret wildfire reserves beneath their feet, lived amidst chaos and oppression, awaiting the end of his reign. But Aerys' end would be an explosion he had planned for the entire realm. The shadow of madness was complete, and the icy flame of destruction was ready to be ignited. King Aerys II had become the greatest enemy of his own realm. His paranoia and obsession with wildfire led him to conspire against his own kingdom. The shadow of his madness hung over King's Landing, ready to explode into an inferno of flames. In the next chapter, we will delve into the final moments of Aerys II's life. You will understand how madness, betrayal, and wildfire collided in the sack of King's Landing, and how the Kingslayer Jaime Lannister became his own king's executioner to save an entire city. Prepare for the whispers of the end of a dynasty that burned to ashes. Final paranoia and the rebellion's trap. Aerys II had become an island of madness, isolated in his Red Keep. Tywin Lannister's departure had removed the last anchor of reason, leaving the king adrift in a sea of delusions. Surrounded now only by fawning courtiers and counselors who confirmed his darkest fantasies, his paranoia turned in fury against the one who should have been his greatest hope, his own son and heir, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. Aerys' envy and hatred toward Rhaegar had transformed into a morbid loathing. He saw Rhaegar's popularity, his intelligence, his beauty, and the dignity with which he carried the Targaryen name not as virtues, but as irrefutable proofs of a conspiracy to usurp his throne. To Aerys, Rhaegar was not a loyal son, but a conspirator, a traitor waiting for the right moment to depose his father. The king began to publicly humiliate Rhaegar, mocking his skills, ridiculing his songs, and questioning his loyalty. Aerys refused to heed Rhaegar's counsel, however wise it was, interpreting every suggestion as a subtle attempt to seize power. He saw Rhaegar's friends and loyalists as accomplices, part of a larger plot against him. Jon Connington, Aerys' ambitious hand of the king who succeeded Tywin, but who was Rhaegar's friend, was constantly watched. Aerys was haunted by the idea that Rhaegar was more Targaryen than he was, and that his madness had made him unworthy. In his delusions, Aerys imagined Rhaegar begging for his throne, crawling and pleading, only to be cruelly denied. This fantasy of humiliating his own son shows how deep the paranoia had become. Even as Robert's rebellion intensified and Targaryen forces were crushed at the Trident, Aerys, in his disturbed mind, might have seen Rhaegar's death not as a tragedy, but as the elimination of a rival. For him, Rhaegar was more of an internal threat than an external enemy. He was the greatest traitor, even in his death. Aerys II's rare decision to attend the tourney at Harrenhal was a key point in his paranoia. He did not go for pleasure, but out of deep distrust. Rumors claimed the tourney had been secretly orchestrated by Rhaegar and his friends as a way to gather the great lords and plot his deposition. Aerys, already immersed in his delusions, firmly believed this. His presence at Harrenhal was not to celebrate but to watch, to seek proof of treason. In his disturbed mind, Aerys saw conspiracies in every corner of the tourney. He believed Lord Went, the host, was a pawn of Tywin Lannister, who in turn was allied with Rhaegar to overthrow him. He saw the feast, the jousts, the conversations, everything as part of a grand scheme against him. The faces of the lords, the whispers, the music, everything was filtered through his paranoia. He was in the midst of a grand event, but in his mind, he was alone against a world of traitors. When Rhaegar crowned Lyanna Stark Queen of Love and Beauty, the world saw an act of forbidden love or a political affront. But for Aerys, it was a confirmation of his worst suspicions. He saw no romance. He saw an act of direct defiance. Rhaegar was not only disrespecting his wife, Princess Elia, but publicly asserting his own authority and independence. This confirmed Aerys in his belief that his own son was actively seeking the throne, using Lyanna as a pawn in his power game. That single gesture, a blue rose, ignited Aerys' hatred for Rhaegar, solidifying his conviction that his own son was the architect of his ruin. Aerys II's madness reached its most brutal point with the execution of Lord Rickard Stark and his son, Brandon. Lyanna Stark's abduction by Rhaegar and Brandon's impetuous challenge to Rhaegar in King's Landing were seen by Aerys not as acts of righteous fury, but as the final proof of Rhaegar's conspiracy. In his mind, the Starks were Rhaegar's pawns, or perhaps in turn, traitors who should be purified. Aerys saw them as the vanguard of a rebellion orchestrated by his own son. He executed them publicly and terribly, believing he was applying Targaryen justice of fire and blood. Rickard Stark, the Lord of Winterfell, was burned alive in his own armor, while Brandon Stark, tied by a noose, strangled himself to death trying to reach a sword to save his father. Aerys believed these acts of extreme cruelty would send a clear message. Treason would not be tolerated. In his distorted mind, he was the great purifying dragon, burning the impure. However, these acts did not crush the rebellion. They ignited it. Aerys' demand for Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark's heads, the last traitors, was the final straw. When Jon Arryn refused to surrender his wards, Robert's rebellion began openly, sweeping across Westeros. For Aerys, this merely confirmed that the entire realm was conspiring against him, that even his most loyal lords were potential traitors. His paranoia had blinded him to reality, and he had fallen into a trap he himself had created. Aerys' madness had become the rebellion's most potent weapon. As the rebellion swept the realm and Targaryen forces suffered defeats, Aerys' madness fixated on one last and terrible purpose: the total destruction of King's Landing. He became convinced that if he could not reign over the city, no one else would. In his delusions, he saw himself as the last and greatest Targaryen dragon, and wildfire was his flame. He had ordered the pyromancers to store colossal quantities of wildfire beneath the septs, the houses, the streets, and the sewers of the capital. It was a secret network of destruction, a plan to turn King's Landing into a blazing tomb. He repeated to himself, "King of Ashes, King of pure destruction." Aerys believed that by burning the city, he would purify himself of all his enemies and prove his supreme power. He saw this as his last and grandest victory, a final purification by fire that would prevent his enemies from inheriting anything from his reign. In this final period, the figures of Varys, the Master of Whispers, and Grand Maester Pycelle took on crucial and enigmatic roles. Varys, the mysterious eunuch, seemed to serve Aerys loyally, but his motivations were always obscure. He was the master of information, the man who whispered in the king's ears. Did he fuel Aerys' paranoia for his own ends, or try to manipulate him for the good of the realm? His loyalty to the Targaryen dynasty remains an enigma to this day. He certainly knew of Aerys' wildfire plans, but what did he do with that information? Pycelle, the Grand Maester, in his apparent senility and frailty, was supposedly a loyal servant of the crown. However, many saw him as a Lannister agent. He always advised Aerys to trust Tywin and to comply with Queen Cersei's wishes. He was a wise man, but his blind obedience to Aerys in his most insane acts and his failure to intervene to curb the king's madness raise questions about his true loyalty and purpose. Both Varys and Pycelle, with their own interests and secrets, contributed to Aerys' isolation and the escalation of his madness, whether by intention or omission, leading the realm to the brink of annihilation. Aerys II had become the architect of his own destruction. His paranoia and obsession with wildfire led him to conspire against his own realm. The shadow of his madness hung over King's Landing, ready to explode into an inferno of flames. In the next and final chapter of the Aerys II saga, we will delve into the Mad King's final moments. You will understand how madness, betrayal, and wildfire collided in the sack of King's Landing, and how the Kingslayer Jaime Lannister became his own king's executioner to save an entire city. Prepare for the whispers of a dynasty's end that burned to ashes. The king's ashes and the contaminated legacy, King Aerys II, the Mad King, was in his final moments, cornered in the Red Keep. Robert's rebellion forces, or rather, Lord Tywin Lannister's army, were approaching King's Landing. In his disturbed mind, Aerys believed Tywin, his former hand, had finally come to save him, a last delusion of trust amidst years of paranoia. Regardless of his past distrust, his madness had blinded him to the inevitable betrayal. He ordered the city gates to be opened. It was the most fatal decision of his reign. Tywin Lannister's army, which had marched quickly to the capital, did not come to save him. They came to sack. When the gates were opened, the city of King's Landing plunged into an inferno of chaos and violence. Lannister soldiers spread through the streets, looting, raping, and murdering without mercy. Screams of horror filled the air, and flames began to consume houses, not the purifying flames Aerys had dreamed of, but the flames of anarchy and vengeance. The city he swore to protect was now a playground for brutality. While King's Landing was being massacred, Aerys, in his chambers on the Iron Throne, was in a frenzy. He screamed orders to his pyromancers to ignite the wildfire hidden beneath the city. "Burn them all!" he vociferated. "Turn the city to ashes! I will reign over bones and fire!" He saw the sacking as a final betrayal and the burning of the capital as his last and grandest victory, a form of purification and total annihilation of his enemies. The pyromancers, fearful and loyal to his madness, hastened to execute his orders, to turn the city into a funeral pyre. They were the last gears of the king's madness, about to ignite the world. Amidst the growing chaos, one man made a choice that would forever mark him. Sir Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, the only Kingsguard knight present in the Red Keep, he faced the ultimate dilemma. His oath was to protect the king. But the king was about to destroy an entire city with wildfire, to commit genocide. Jaime was there, witnessing the hell Aerys had planned. Jaime confronted Aerys in the throne room. The king, with his torn clothes and hoarse voice, was delirious, repeating to himself the orders to burn the city. His eyes burned with a feverish madness. He ordered the wildfire to be activated, that the hundreds of thousands of lives in King's Landing be consumed by the green flames. Aerys believed he would be reborn as a dragon from the ashes. Jaime's internal conflict was brutal. Honor versus humanity, oath versus the salvation of innocence. In a moment that lasted an eternity, Jaime made his decision. With his blade, he plunged his sword into Aerys II's back, killing him right there on the Iron Throne. The Mad King's body collapsed ingloriously, far from the fiery rebirth he so desired. The silence that followed Jaime's act was chilling, broken only by the distant screams of the sack. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, had saved the city, but condemned his name for posterity. Aerys II's death marked the end of the Targaryen dynasty on the Iron Throne. However, the sack of King's Landing continued for days, even after the king's death. The soldiers' fury was uncontrollable. The city was in ruins, its streets filled with dead and wounded. When Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark entered the capital, they found Aerys dead and Jaime Lannister sitting on the Iron Throne. Robert's reaction was one of relief, but Ned, a man of unwavering honor, saw in Jaime not a hero, but a kingslayer, an oathbreaker, which would be the beginning of a deep contempt. Aerys II's legacy is a grim warning in Westeros history. He is remembered as the Mad King, the monarch whose paranoia, cruelty, and obsession with fire led to the annihilation of his own dynasty. His madness contaminated the Targaryen name for future generations, creating a deeply rooted fear that madness ran in the family of the Dragon House. His story serves as a brutal lesson about the dangers of unchecked power, self-consuming distrust, and the price of folly. Furthermore, Aerys' obsession with distorted prophecies and his mania for setting his enemies ablaze ultimately obscured Aegon's true prophecy, the Song of Ice and Fire. Aerys believed his wildfire was the ultimate solution, but his madness only made the realm less prepared for the true threat from the north. He, in his quest for a fiery rebirth, ironically, ensured that the Targaryens would no longer have dragons to face the real danger, leaving Westeros vulnerable. His life was a monument to the futility of blind fury, and his ashes a reminder that even the greatest kings can fall when the mind disintegrates. The Mad King's reign was a tragic odyssey of fury and paranoia, culminating in the end of a dynasty. But beyond the ashes of his reign, a new path opened for Westeros. In the next Whispers of Westeros, we will delve into the lives of Visenya and Rhaenys Targaryen, Aegon the Conqueror's powerful sister wives. You will understand the crucial role of these queens who shaped Westeros and how their influence extends beyond Aegon's shadow. Prepare for the whispers of the true queens of Blood and Fire.